Hi everyone, it's Dr. Marks, and our topic for today is supply and supply shifters. Now, one thing I want you to keep in mind is that if you understand demand, supply is really easy. You're going to see that it basically works the same way. We're going to have a definition, just like we had definition of demand, we're going to have definition of supply. Just like we had the law of demand, we're going to have the law of supply. Just like we had ceteris paribus assumptions that shifted demand, we're going to have the same kind of thing. There are ceteris paribus assumptions that will shift supply. So let's get started. We're going to start, as we did with demand, with the definition. So let's define what we mean by supply. When we talk about supply, if we're defining it, we would formally define it as what suppliers are prepared to put on the market for sale. So what suppliers are prepared to put on the market for sale under specific circumstances under specific circumstances and for a given period of time. So, supply is what suppliers are prepared to put on the market for sale under specific circumstances for a given period of time. So just as we did for demand, let's pick this apart. Let's start by talking about what we mean when we say suppliers. Now, we have firms that produce things. So some firms produce things, and some just supply things. So what am I talking about? My words keep disappearing, I don't know why. All right, so if we're talking about a firm that produces things, let's think about some kind of bread. So when I grew up, we used to get Mrs. Baird's bread. And I think they're actually out of Richmond. So Mrs. Baird's bread produced bread at their factory, but they might not have literally put them on the market for sale. We might have other firms that supply things, but they didn't produce them. So Walmart is a supplier of Mrs. Baird's bread. So Mrs. Baird's is producing things and selling them to places like Walmart. So they're supplying them, but to intermediaries like Walmart. And then a place like Walmart, they didn't produce the bread, but yet they make it available. So we want to be very careful. And that's why I don't use the word producer. So let me make that note. A supplier is not always a producer, right? Walmart is not a producer of Mrs. Baird's bread. Mrs. Baird's, the company, is a producer of the bread. So a supplier is not always a producer, and that's why I kind of have to use a definition using the same word, right? Professors hate that. So what suppliers are prepared to put on the market? I didn't say producers. The second thing we need to remember about suppliers is that these could be firms supplying goods and services, so firms might be the ones supplying goods and services, but remember we can also think about households, right? Households, people like you and me, might be supplying labor. So remember what we talked about, there's a dual role here, right? A dual role. So firms, businesses might be supplying goods or services, but you and I as households are also suppliers. We're suppliers of labor. So we want to keep that in mind. Okay, so we understand what we mean by suppliers. The second thing we need to highlight is put on the market for sale. So note that we're talking about something that's available. So these are goods and services that are available. Now you might be thinking, well, what else could they be? Well, let's think of an example. What if I'm an oil company and I extract oil from the ground and then I store the oil in a warehouse in my inventory. In other words, In other words, what I'm saying is that it's not available for sale. Let me get back to my slide. It's not available for sale. It's simply part of my inventory. All right? So if I produce something, I put it in my inventory, but it's not for sale, then it is not part of supply. So if it's in my inventory and it's not for sale, then it's not part of supply. Well, you might be thinking, well, why in the world would a firm extract oil and just leave it in a warehouse? Well, maybe those producers think the price of oil is going to go up in the near future. So instead of putting it on the market now, I want to put it in the market maybe a month later. So I'm kind of hedging. Well, if I'm just sitting on the oil waiting for the price to go up, it's not part of supply. The next thing that we need to highlight in our definition is under specific circumstances. So remember, under specific circumstances refers to those ceteris paribus assumptions. We had 5 of them for demand. Well, we're also going to have 5 for supply. So the ceteris paribus assumptions, remember, are those variables that we hold constant along a given supply curve. So variables we hold constant along a given supply curve. Variables we hold constant along a given supply curve. And remember, these are also going to be supply shifters. So if one of these variables changes, then we know supply will shift. Okay? So we're going to have to learn the ceteris paribus assumptions for supply. Finally, we want to make a note that just like demand, supply is defined for a given period of time. So it could be in a month, it could be a quarter, it could be a year. And I'm going to admit that I'm going to get a little sloppy here, and I'm not going to continuously say this represents supply for 1 year, this represents supply for a month. So I'm going to apologize in advance, but just remember that there's some period of time. All right, so now we have the definition of supply. Hopefully you see that it looks very much like the definition of demand. It has the same parts. So just like we had the law of demand, we're going to have the law of supply. Well, here we have to think from the perspective of a supplier. And so you're used to being demanders, but you don't think about being a supplier very often. So let's use as an example that we're talking about a student who offers babysitting services. All right. Well, if you're a student and you're offering babysitting services, then do you agree that you are a supplier, right? You're offering your labor. So everyone, in your mind, think about how you would behave as a supplier of babysitting services. Well, let's think about price versus quantity supplied. Let's say that you're going to get paid $5 an hour. Now, for $5 an hour, how many hours would you be willing to work? Maybe none, maybe only 1 hour. You know, I mean, I'll help somebody out if they're in a bind, but I'm not looking to spend a lot of time working for $5 an hour. Well, what if I raise that to $8 an hour? Well, now you might be thinking, well, that's not bad. It's above minimum wage. So I'm willing to work 3 hours of babysitting at $8 an hour. But what if I say, okay, look, for $12 an hour, you're probably thinking, okay, now I'm going to make some pretty good money. I'm willing to give you 8 hours a week at $12. But if you were offered 15, I bet you'd give me even more hours. So at $15 an hour, you'd give me 13 hours of babysitting. So let's take a look. What do we see about the relationship here? We see that as price goes up, quantity supplied goes up, right? If we're going to get a higher and higher price, we're going to be willing to put more on the market for sale. So if you're going to pay me more and more, I'm going to be willing to give you more and more hours. But the same thing is true. If price falls, now I was getting 12, now you're going to give me 8. Well, the quantity supplied of my hours for babysitting is going to fall. But just like the law of demand, remember that this is going to be holding true when we hold all else constant. So I'm going to make that caveat, holding all else constant. So this relationship is only true when none of the ceteris paribus assumptions are changing. So holding all else constant, all of the ceteris paribus assumptions are constant. They are not changing. All right, now, do we agree here that this works differently than the law of demand? Because the law of demand says if price goes up, I'm going to buy less. But here, if price goes up, I'm going to put more units on the market for sale. So what we see here is a positive relationship. So there's a positive relationship between price and quantity. But what do we remember about the law of demand? Price and quantity worked in the opposite direction. So let's just make a note. So for demand, remember, we were talking about law of demand. If price went up, quantity demanded went down. And if price went down, then quantity demanded went up. Because here under demand, we're buyers. But law of supply, we are sellers, right? So the law of demand told us that there's an inverse or negative relation between price and quantity. All right? So, law of supply, law of demand. One is a positive relationship, the other is a negative relationship. But notice, both have that same caveat that they only hold true when all else is constant. Okay? Okay. One other thing in case you don't have it in your notes, instead of quantity demanded, QS, quantity supplied. That's probably obvious, but just in case. All right. So we have the law of supply. So again, demand and supply, definitions look similar. We have the law of demand, and now we have the law of supply. So do you see, if you understand one, you really understand the other. Now we need to make the distinction between supply and quantity supplied. we're going to get in the habit of calling supply S and calling quantity supplied, oops, sorry about that. Let me fix that. Quantity supplied QS. All right, so that will be much easier if you get in the habit of using that notation. So just like we had the distinction between demand and quantity demanded, we need to make the same distinction between supply and quantity supplied. So supply is going to be suppliers' behavior over a range of prices. Notice that that definition is almost like the definition of demand, right? It shows demanders' behavior over a range of prices for demand. Supply shows suppliers' behavior over a range of prices. So, if we're going to graph supply, we're going to have quantity supply on the horizontal axis, and we're going to have price on the vertical axis. So remember what we learned. We said that price and quantity supplied are positively related, right? So if I'm going to get a higher price, I'm going to put more hours of my labor on the market for sale. If I'm going to get a higher price for the product I'm selling, loaves of bread, I'm going to put more on the market for sale. So supply curves are upward sloping. And notice that it's just like an if-then statement because it's going across a range of prices. All right? So when we talk about supply, we're talking about this whole curve. All right? So the term supply shows that whole relationship. So it's kind of an if-then idea. Instead, if we're talking about quantity supplied, it's slightly different. Quantity supplied is going to show suppliers' behavior at a particular price. Suppliers' behavior at a particular price. So what we're saying here is that if price is $20, then I'm going to give you 24 hours a week of babysitting. We're at a particular price. So we can graph this. Again, price is on the vertical axis and quantity supplied is on the horizontal axis. We know that supply is an upward sloping function because it maps together price and quantity. But in this case, we're at a particular price. So price is 20. If price is 20, then it puts me at point A on the supply curve, and quantity supplied is 24. So when we talk about quantity supplied, we're talking about this right here. But it's quantity supplied at a price of $20. So look at the difference between these two. And it's exactly like the distinction between demand and quantity demanded. Supply refers to the whole relationship. If price is 5, if price is 6, if price is 7, if price is 8, we're going across a whole range of prices. And so we have a curve. That's what we call it. So this over here was our supply curve. And even though it's linear, we still call it a supply curve. But over here, notice when we talk about quantity supplied, we're at a given point on a supply curve. So make sure that you make those distinctions. I'm going to be very clear that You need to understand the distinction, and just like demand and quantity demanded, demand and quantity demanded are different. Supply and quantity supplied are different. So you need to be able to make the distinction. And you need to use these terms carefully. They don't mean the same thing. But at the same time, not that I try to write trick questions, but if I'm going to try to trick you, this would be the point. I'm going to test you. So test questions will look to see if you understand the difference. So be sure that you understand that idea.